Hello and welcome to Horizon Scan. Today Peter and Tony are talking about how the pandemic is progressing, and they start by considering the implications of the forthcoming flu season.
So everybody who's going to have flu is going to be assumed also to have COVID-19 rather than just say, well, this is obviously flu.
Right. So it's the combination of symptoms rather than the combination of viruses.
That's right. So, before this, somebody coming with those sort of symptoms, you would say, well, it's either a cold or flu. Now we've got an added complication.
Yeah.
With the, but I just thought it was what I thought you might.
When would you expect the flu season in inverted commas to begin?
Historically begins, a lot of it depends on the weather to a degree, but it is around December, January when it really kicks off. And that's why vaccinations tend to be around November.
Yeah, isn't peak flu around Valentine's Day?
Because the peak is, but I think what you said is when's it starting? It usually starts around that. So at Christmas time, quite often people are sort of, when they relax and they come from work because they've been to parties, they usually have Christmas Day that they can't taste anything because they have the beginnings of influenza and or cold or respiratory syncytial virus or whatever's going around at the moment.
Yeah. Have you heard about this long COVID that I've heard about? This sort of hangover of.
Oh yeah, yeah. We knew that fairly early on, and in fact, the guy who the patient I was involved in was actually one of the first examples I had. He was the one who tested positive 4 weeks afterwards, as some of his colleagues did, and he had symptoms which then were not recognized as part of COVID, which was memory dysfunction, concentration, a bit of post-viral fatigue type stuff.
Yeah.
And so long COVID is one of those aftermaths of COVID, which can affect any organ, to be honest with you. And that's it, because we're still learning. I mean, what has changed a little bit, Peter, is that there appears to be some better understanding of the immunological mechanisms now, in that the people who produce antibodies, they tend to be around possibly for about 2 to 3 months and then go off. But there is this T cell response of the immune system, which they believe can still kick in. And we know that in lots of other viruses as well. And the reason they're talking about that is it kind of puts some hope in terms of a vaccine, albeit I think the vaccine or a panaceic vaccine, as I call it, is a long way off.
Yeah.
It may be there will, as I said at the last webinar, I said we may end up with several vaccines for different reasons, but I can't see anything valid before Christmas.
And we've already got some things which help even if they don't vaccinate, and can see more of those sorts of things.
The data on that is that there are things that can help in the journey, if we put it like that. But in terms of material effect, the effect is about 20 to 30% in patients. And at the moment, and I think I'm fairly up to date, it doesn't have a material effect on mortality.
Right.
But it'll shorten the disease process and it may shorten the severity. But actually, when patients are very severe, then the figures are about 20 to 30%, and that's when it was. But the control trials are still going on, Peter, especially in the UK.
So the latest stuff out of the data makes it look as though it really is conforming to what we thought, which is it goes east to west and then it goes north to south.
Yeah.
Seems to be heavily concentrated in South America, Central and South America right now.
Yeah.
South Africa maybe. In terms of acceleration, there are quite a number of places in Africa, and of course that data is somewhat suspect anyway. But it's interesting too. I don't know whether you've seen my latest numbers, but Europe appears to have got a cluster around Moldova, Bulgaria, Bosnia Herzegovina, all that area there where it's really starting to motor.
Did they feature in the beginning of your data collection?
They were there, but all at lower levels.
You and I have had discussions, spirited debates about what do we mean by a second wave. I'm more convinced now that what we have now is the first one never went away. And it was less, but it's still going on. And so places like Leicester and Shutdown and Manchester and things, it seems that there was still the virus around, which is then actually now expanded into where it is now, rather than something new coming in.
So I'm reading in a couple of places that, for example, WHO has just put out that 20, 30-year-olds are now seen as a significant part of the infection chain.
You know, we kind of suspected that anyway. Do you
You
remember?
always thought it was kids in there messing about, even if they didn't suffer from symptoms.
You know, I think the younger generation kind of did have an attitude, well, you know, if I'm not obese and I don't have diabetes and hypertension, I'm not over X, then we're okay. And you saw that in the behaviors in terms of their personal protection. I think we now realize that that isn't the case. A lot of us kind of felt it anyway. And then the other thing that I think is coming out, Peter, is that the timelines in terms of from infection to producing symptoms and to how long you're infectious is now becoming a little bit clearer. And that was published in the WHO relatively recently. So whilst the non-infection or pre-infectious individuals are potentially infectious, they only become really infectious when the symptoms come.
And what are those timelines seen as?
It appears it's around day 3 or 4 from the time they get infected to the time they produce symptoms, and then that can last up until 10 days. So it could be 7 to 10 days, depending on the severity of the symptoms, but they are most infectious at the beginning of the cycle of the symptoms when the virus is in the upper respiratory tract. And then it causes haywire other places where they tend to have less of the respiratory type symptoms. So where are we? Well, we're kind of knowing a little bit more about things that we wanted to know about. But I think everybody agrees the game changer will be the vaccine until those controlled trials come through on some of the medications. I just feel that if you look at the press, and we've had discussions about how useful the press can be in this pandemic or not, in that there was very upbeat headlines. If you then corner the virologist, they then have a slightly different temperature, as it were, in terms of the possibility that this will be due in X. And I suppose you have to be optimistic, really. But if I look at the people who are doing this, there's a kind of, just in that background, this degree of uncertainty. And also, how would we know it's effective, given that you actually need to have a degree of prevalence of the disease to see whether the vaccine works in a controlled trial. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there's a lot of work going, and there's several of them going on.
It's quite interesting when you look at the country profiles that I publish. You can see the different characteristics, and you can see the ones that just look implausible.
Yes. Well, you've been saying that for some time now, actually.
And you can see the ones that have got just either a chaotic reporting system or something. stuff is absolutely all over the map, and in some ways, the character of the data is much more important than the blooming numbers.
Yeah.
I was talking to somebody this morning who was saying, well, of course, testing plays a big impact on cases. Well, it does, but if you've got a curved slope like that on testing, that's infection doing that. It's not testing. Yes. Producing an exponential curve like that, regardless of whether what the various heights are, and so those are the things I look for, more for the character of what I'm seeing, rather than the precise numbers. Or in many ways, I don't look at the scale at all. Have you seen anything in to give an idea of what the current view is of the level of infection, the rate of fatality, the spread of symptoms, how many of these and how many of those? Well, what's the current view?
I think, as I read it, the pre-infection and the non-symptomatics, the view is that, yes, they are an issue, but not as important as it was thought, because you really got to be spreading symptoms via droplet, coughing, sneezing, singing, talking, in enclosed atmospheres. Yeah. Albeit, as you know, there's a lot of research about actually the potential environmental contamination. By that I mean how much of that is actually causing a problem. The cases which were referred to as the super spreaders, these were one individual actually affecting a lot of people, came from initially the States with the choirs. That's where the singing came from. And also the case in Italy where they were in the chalet where they were very enclosed. And it seems that indoors is the highest infectious risk.
There was a family group, wasn't there, that they couldn't figure out how they got the wretched thing, and it turned out that they'd sat in the same seat in the church.
That's right.
As somebody who got it had done. It was several days before, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah. So the incubation period seems to be between 3 to 5 days, 6 days, but it can be actually longer than that. But these instances where it seems that the common thing there probably is talking and singing seems to produce a lot of droplets. And also, and I'm speculating here, churches don't have a lot of ventilation other than opening the door. Yeah, they're quiet places. Mm. I was in a cathedral recently, and the air was still.
Yeah.
So nothing's moving, because that's the way they are designed, and it helps the auditory sort of stuff. So I think groups of people, I think we're going to see with the opening. I expected there were going to be more cases given the lockdown, as I hadn't expected was released earlier than I thought. And I think we've had this discussion before. And it still may be early days yet in terms of those actually coming through in terms of the data that you've been plotting in terms of death rates and things like that. Maybe early days. Although at the moment things seem to be relatively quiet, don't they?
In the UK, yes. I mean, they're anything but quiet in some other places.
What about the business imperatives as we discussed last time? I mean, we are now beginning, I think, to see some of the decisions being made about how businesses have struggled and how they now see it going forward. M&S, for example, today, and a few other retail are beginning actually now to some of the more economic impacts.
So what probably the single thing that concerns me most, or it gives me most pause for thought, is what I've heard described as pandemic nonchalance.
Mm-hmm.
And it's palpable among all those people who've been on the beach and, you know, goodness knows where else. You know, it doesn't take much poking around on the BBC website to see evidence of pandemic nonchalance. And I'm trying not to see a mixture of pandemic nonchalance and cynicism among business decision makers. Inevitably, there's a spread.
Yeah.
People over here who are properly responsible, caring, thinking, planning, diligent, and there's the others over here who aren't, and there's a spread in between.
There is.
So there's two immediate things that occur to me. There are some businesses where you have got a high degree of control and ability to influence what people do. I was talking to somebody earlier in the week, works for a large firm based in Canary Wharf.
Yes.
44-floor building. And apart from the concourse, the elevators and the toilets, where they've got to be very careful, they can control everybody, you know,
Yes.
on the floors and all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
But then you've got the public transport system where your chance of controlling people is next to nil, frankly.
Correct.
And you know, I mean, I really get that. The other thing that occurs to me is that we're still in the relatively good weather.
Yes.
And you know, what on earth is going to happen, you know, when the weather turns?
I think some businesses have already considered that. So if I look at my practice dealing with organizations, a lot of those organizations really have told their staff that they ain't coming back before Christmas. Okay. And then the other thing is, as I think we said last time, or maybe I didn't, is that there are opportunities here in business now to review actually staffing and to cut some of the fat out anyway, whether that's driven by COVID-19 or whatever, but they're accelerating. I think, as you said, we have lived 5 months where it normally would take 5 years. Yeah, I think it was the old phrase.
Yeah.
So for me personally, in my speciality, it is about people at work and the issues like that. That's completely shifted now. And that is not people actually having issues at work. It's actually what happens with people who are not at work, certainly in the service sector. Of the organizations that I advise, I said I was actually impressed and surprised on how quickly they had got their policy, practice, and procedures in place for this. Because what I hadn't realized is a lot of these organizations have their businesses within larger buildings. And it was the owners of those larger buildings that had actually done all the policy, practice, and procedures. So my impression that they were really ahead of the game as an organization, what I had forgotten was they had to abide by the rules of the land, of the building and the landlord of that building they were doing.
Yeah.
And the policies were quite impressive. And a lot of industry groups had actually been very good doing it. And that's what I meant when I said I was impressed. But I don't know how long that will last because of all the reasons that we've said. And certainly in the public sector, public transport side, I think initially it was okay when the numbers were small and there was a high prevalence rate. As that drops down, there becomes, to use your words, a nonchalance, or at its worst, a don't care bit, or both.
Or even worse, just straightforward cantankerous behaviour.
And we've seen some of that. So I think, was there not a group of people that went into one of the food stores that had a problem about people wearing masks because it was dictating people what they should do against their human rights. Didn't use the word human rights. Don't know whether you read about that.
Yeah.
And there was an incident about it. So as I said right at the beginning of this pandemic, we will see the best and the worst of human behavior.
Yeah.
And it ain't over yet.
No, and in many ways, the first encounter it is, it takes everybody by surprise, and it's new, and all that kind of stuff. I think it gets very much harder for policymakers and decision makers and people who have to execute on the ground when it becomes another wave, another lockdown. I'm faced with these three trends all going in the wrong direction. It's amazing how this is penetrating around the world. It's just amazing. I don't know whether you've had a look at my chart 12, as I call it. So you can see that the number of countries here, this is number of countries that are recording daily fatalities in these three bands. So any daily fatality rates above 0.1, and you can see there's this quite clear shelving.
Yes.
And then here, third week of July, it suddenly starts to power north. We're one short of 100 today.
Right.
99 countries on that list now. And you can see that all the bands are growing. So not only is the number of countries,
They're all doing it together. They're doing it. There's a trend.
There's a trend that there are more countries and more of them are growing.
Yes.
And so you've got this great big pool of virus out there that's all over the place. That's trend number one. Trend number two, you and I have talked about, which is the growing nonchalance and variability of and cantankerous behaviour and all that kind of thing. That's not going in the right direction. And lastly, you've got to include the weather. We're maybe 4, 5, 6 weeks away from it turning seriously cold and wet.
Yep.
At that point, everybody goes inside, and the virus gets a boost to its ability to infect.
Many thanks, Tony and Peter. The ongoing impact of Covid-19 is clearly developing, so we really appreciate you keeping us up to speed. As usual, if you'd like to continue this discussion with either Peter or Tony, then you'll find their contact details at the end of this video. Thanks again and goodbye.